All right, guys. So I know you've been taking a lot of notes over the past couple of days. This is the last set, I promise. And we're going to kind of get into some reading here at this point. But we need to talk about the literary techniques that are specific to the Anglo-Saxons that we're going to be seeing in Beowulf, because there's some really, really specific ones that you probably haven't run into yet that are really important for this story. So the first is a motif. Okay, so a motif is just a recurring idea or image in a work of literature. A lot of times we're going to see biblical and Christian allusions are a motif that happens a fair amount within Beowulf in particular, but Anglo-Saxon literature in general. We're going to see pagan customs. We're also going to see social customs, like the idea of like blood debt, the idea of fate and weird, that kind of thing are going to be important. The idea of a kind of a ruler who takes care of their people, that kind of thing. We're going to see traits of warrior, specifically Anglo-Saxon warriors, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, and boasting, right, which is a very Anglo-Saxon thing. And we'll talk about that more with Unferth's challenge next week. So Beowulf doesn't actually take place in England, which I know is confusing considering it's Anglo-Saxon literature, but it takes place in Geatland and Denmark, right? So Geatland is what is modern day Sweden. So basically, it's Vikings is kind of the people that are populating Beowulf, but the Anglo Saxons kind of put their ideals on these kind of characters. It takes place in an imaginary land that doesn't actually exist, but it deals with three archetypal places of fear. And by archetypal, I just mean like typical, right? A typical example of fear, right? So barricaded night house or mead hall. So Grendel, which is this kind of massive monster that's at the heart of Beowulf, can invade the mead hall, a place where we're supposed to feel safe, and then kind of turn it into this place of nightmare. So it's something that kind of taps into some deep human fears, right? When we're in our homes, we feel safe. It's the one place that we kind of can feel safe. So when those things are invaded, it creates a huge amount of fear. We also have the infested underwater lair. This is going to be dealing with Grendel's mother. So like Jaws, right? We're not water animals. We're not aquatic creatures. We don't do very well in the water. We can't hold our breath. We can't breathe in underwater. We can't see very well underwater. We're just not well equipped to be fighting there. So this idea that there are predators there that can do terrible things to us makes kind of oceans and deep lakes and things like that kind of a scary thing. And then lastly, the reptile haunted rocks of like a wilderness or a cave. And that's when we deal with the dragon, because Beowulf actually fights a dragon in addition to two other monsters. And so basements, right? These dark areas where we're not quite sure what's going on. So we have these kind of three archetypal settings of human fear, things that make us anxious. We see a lot of Christian and pagan influences in Beowulf, because what we have is essentially a pagan story that is then retold by a Christian monk who does a fair amount of editorializing. The Beowulf poet puts in a lot of things that probably weren't in the original, because he's a monk. He thinks that that Christianity is very, very important, and he kind of wants to paper over the more pagan aspects of Beowulf before Christianity arrived in England and was brought to the Anglo-Saxons. So in terms of Christian influences, there's a ton of direct allusions to God and other biblical stories, including Cain and Abel. The idea of eternal life, often after death. The idea of forgiveness, and being able to forgive others. The fact that this focuses on there's peace, right, with these other tribes, right? Denmark and Geatland are not fighting. Instead, we have a foreign person come in to help Hrothgar solve his problems, as opposed to kind of creating other problems. And instead, they're fighting a monster that is, in the words of the Beowulf poet, hell-forged, right? So this kind of diabolical, devil enemy. And in the dialogue, we have multiple characters that thank the Christian God for their help and attribute their own greatness to God, as opposed to themselves. So pagan influence, again, there's still a lot of that left over in Beowulf, despite Beowulf poet's best efforts. So one is the idea of fate and how important it is. Two is the idea of revenge. Beowulf and Grendel and the fight with Grendel's mother is a great example of that. We have huge warlike tendencies. All of Beowulf's greatness is predicated on the fact that he is a great warrior. So that's pretty important. We have the value of physical objects like a sword, about how important those objects are. Christianity would argue that we shouldn't put our faith in physical objects, and so we should put our faith in God. Whereas in Beowulf, we kind of see this prized armor and weaponry as being really, really important. The idea of taking a war prize, of taking kind of a piece of your enemy with you after you vanquish them to show everybody that you vanquished them. Not a super Christian ideal. Funeral pyres, Christianity, especially early Christianity, didn't believe in cremation because they argued that you needed your body whole in order to kind of go to heaven. And in the action, we have characters who are deeply prideful, who long for glory, for fame, for gold, for kind of earthly goods. All of which would be kind of in direct contrast to the idea of Christianity, where one is supposed to be humble and forsake earthly goods for kind of your heavenly reward, that kind of thing. The two really important literary devices that we see, the three most important literary devices that we see in Anglo-Saxon literature are alliterations, kennings, and caesuras. So an alliteration is the repetition of the beginning consonant sound in the line of poetry. So, that Sally sells seashells is one of the most common. So any tongue twister really is an example of alliteration. But depending on what is being alliterated, it can have a really different effect on the story. So a lot of times when Grendel is present in the story, there'll be a repeated S, right? So this kind of sibilant hissing sound, which makes us think of snakes and things that kind of speak to that lizard brain in us that freak us out. Or you might have really hard consonants that are repeated during a time of battle to kind of mimic the loud noises and violence of the battle. So alliteration isn't just that they're repeating words for the sake of it. It's that they're repeating words because those sounds themselves have some sort of impact on the meaning of the poem. Kennings are used a ton in Anglo-Saxon literature, and it's a metaphorical phrase that replaces one noun, right? So instead of calling it the sea, you might call it a whale's home, right? Because whales live in the ocean. Or you might call armor battle dress because it's what you dress yourself up in when you're going to battle. Or they might call battle a spear play, right? Because there's the idea that, kind of like sword play, right? This idea that there's, it's kind of like a dance between these two. So it's like a little riddle a lot of times, right? You have to try and figure out what the heck are they talking about. But they're really effective and can be quite beautiful. Lastly, we have caesura, and this is a pause in the middle of a line of poetry. So each line is separated by a pause or a break in the middle of the line. And each part will have like two strong beats, right? And it's just this big dramatic pause in the middle of a line as a way to try and kind of get your audience to hang on your every word and be curious about what's going to come next, right? So you have then the Scylding warrior, savage and grim, seized the ring hilt and swung the sword, struck with fury, despairing of life, thrust at the throat, broke through the bone rings, the stout blade stabbed through her faded flesh, right? And we have these really strong beats in each part, right? Scylding warrior, savage and grim, swung the sword, seized the ring hilt, struck with fury, despairing of life. And then that pause in the middle where your audience is just going to be kind of wondering what's going to come next. So that takes care of the Anglo-Saxon lit devices. I didn't give you guided notes for this. It's kind of up to you to take good notes from this. So just make sure that the information from the PowerPoint makes it onto your notes. Again, you don't have to worry about you don't have to write down this whole poetry piece. Just make sure that we know what a caesura, what a kenning is, what an alliteration is. You've written down at least some of the Christian and pagan influences of Beowulf. And we know a little bit about the setting. We know what a motif is. And those are kind of the highlights of what you need for your notes. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you guys later. Bye.